Now it's time for today's perspective on the programme, and my guest today is someone who at the age of just 13 years old was sexually assaulted. Now at the time she thought it was normal, saying she didn't realise that sexual violence can occur without physical pain necessarily being inflicted. Then, later, she found out the person who raped her went on to do it to one of her friends, and it made her so emotional that she decided to hit back. And now in her adult life, not only does she study and research issues of gender and education, she's also become a sexual assault activist. She was behind a huge teachers' consent movement in Australia, which in turn spurred the Everyone's Invited campaign in the UK. Well, Chanel Contos joins us now on the programme. Thanks very much for being with us on France 24. I'd like to start off, if I may, by finding out exactly what happened to you and where this all came from. Tell us about what happened to you when you were younger.
Well, when I was younger, so for context, I grew up in Sydney, Australia, which is obviously classified a very developed place in the scheme of the world. But basically what happened to me and my friends was wide-scale sexual violence that was very normalized to us because it was often acts of sexual coercion or, being peer pressured into drinking alcohol by boys who would then take advantage of us later in the night. Those sort of actions that led us to be sexually assaulted. And because those don't fit a stereotypical category of rape or sexual violence or sexual assault, it takes many years and education to realize that that was actually wrong and not just a normal part of growing up.
Yeah, at the time you really thought it was just completely normal?
Yeah, I mean, from my own experience from speaking to friends and stuff, it feels wrong. You know that there's something not okay about it. In my instance, the boy who did it to me apologized to me the next day because he knew it made me upset. But I was never educated enough to call that an instance of sexual violence.
And was there one moment when you suddenly thought, actually, no, stop, this isn't right, or was it a gradual process?
Well, for me, it was, I don't really want to talk about my own story too explicitly because it's not about the fact that it happened to me, it's about the fact that it happened to everyone. But for me, it was coercion, it was ongoing pressure, and it was there was physical force involved as well, but there was no pain and there was no overt violence. And I think for me, the moment where I thought this was actually really not okay was actually years later when I received consent education, realized what consent was, realized that it was something that had to be given, realized it was something that I never gave, and then realized that it was an instance of rape.
And what made you want to kind of turn this into something that you wanted to go on to study and to kind of fight for other people as well?
I've always been interested in gender equality, which is why I was doing my master's in gender, except the kind of pivotal moment for deciding to make this a public campaign and going forward with my own story. And again, talking about the fact that it wasn't just me, but it was the masses and asking people to submit testimonies to prove that. Was realizing how preventable this was, realizing that that boy did not wake up that morning and decide that he wanted to hurt someone or hurt me or rape anyone. That act was normal to him, just as normal as it was to me. And what I realized is if we were taught respect, consent, if we were taught about sex from a young age, all of these things felt very preventable. And when finding out that this boy did the same thing to my friend a year later, I just felt responsible in a way, which I know I shouldn't, but I did because I thought if I had done something then it wouldn't have happened to her later. And now I think, well, maybe if he received consent education, he would have never done it to either of us.
And you actually did an Instagram poll, didn't you, with some quite shocking results?
Yeah, so the initial Instagram poll was just to my immediate friends. It's not as if I had a large following or anything. And I just asked, has anyone else been sexually assaulted by someone who went to an all-boys school in Sydney? So it was a very specific at the beginning, and then it led into a national campaign. And in 24 hours, over 200 people had said yes. And then within 2 weeks, 6,000 people had detailed testimonies of their experience of sexual violence, naming the school that they went to and the school that their perpetrator went to on teachersconsent.com.
So tell us how it turned into a national. I mean, you sort of given us a feeling there, but you decided at that point that you wanted to take it even further and take it to the media and try and get a lot more people involved to raise awareness.
Yeah, well, so the original intention was basically to get my old school and the nearby schools to start teaching consent education because they're independent schools in Australia, which means they have the ability to work outside of the Australian curriculum. But there was just such a flood of responses. And I mean, obviously I come from Sydney, but this isn't just a Sydney issue. This is a whole of Australia. It's a whole of the world issue. So once opening the campaign to a national level, it was alongside a petition, and over 44,000 Australians signed this petition demanding that consent education be mandated. It was basically overnight. The media started approaching me, asking for stories. There was basically hours between posting that Instagram poll and it being kind of front page of the news. And over a year of campaigning and working with politicians and lots of other things going on in Australia on the topic of gender equality and women's rights and sexual assault, consent education has now been mandated in Australian schools from kindergarten until year 10 every year, which is great.
Yeah, what kind of education do you think is needed? I mean, is it just, bringing it up in classes, or actually specific classes which really target this issue?
There needs to be specific classes on the issue. So the way that it's now embedded in the Australian curriculum is that there's basically points that teachers need to tick off to ensure that they have taught the students that education. However, while that is a great start and I'm so happy and proud of it, there needs to be way more than that done. We need to have conversations with parents. We need to make sure our media is reflecting healthy attitudes and respectful relationships. There needs to be a change of attitudes in peers around what's normal, around how to treat your boyfriend, your girlfriend, all these different things. It's a good first step, but there's definitely much further to go. And whilst it's great that it is mandated explicitly in schools, it needs to be a whole of community approach.
Yeah, it does sound like a fabulous start, but do you think it's ever really completely stoppable? Is there any way to stop this happening altogether?
I think rape will always exist, unfortunately. I think there will always be people who will want to inflict violence on others and hurt others. However, I think the vast majority of sexual violence, especially in countries like Australia and countries like France, is preventable. I really do think that, because I think so much of this is perpetrated due to ignorance and a lack of education and sexual entitlement, rather than a desire to inflict violence on another. And that can be combated with a change of culture and with education. And I think that that's where we need to mainly focus our prevention on that wide-scale sexual violence that so often occurs in teen years. There was a recent survey in Australia of Australian high school students, and almost 1/3 of young girls had experienced unwanted sex before the age of 15. And I think that rings alarms about how young we need to be having these conversations.
Yeah, the figures are quite shocking, aren't they? Toxic culture is something, which we've all been to school. We know that it exists in other areas as well, such as bullying, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And it's things, and bullying's gotten a lot of attention recently, especially cyberbullying and the implications that has on people. But we really need to delve into education around consent education and healthy intimacy in order to prevent this preventable crime.
One last question for you. Where can you take this any further?
Well, if anyone wants to look more at what we do, we've got teachersconsent.com. We've got Instagram @teachersconsent. And we need to see what happens next. The next step in Australia is implementing this consent education, because it's one thing to have it in the curriculum, but all that matters is what that individual teacher is teaching the students on the day that consent education is meant to be the topic of conversation. So implementation is a big focus of the Australian government at the moment. And also, I guess, looking to see if this is something that could be taken overseas in future, and using the new Australian curriculum that so much work went into to be a model for other countries.
Chanel Contos, great to have you on the programme today. Thanks ever so much. It does sound like a great campaign that you've got going there. Let's hope it continues to bear fruit. Thanks very much, Chanel Contos, joining us.